This is a 55-minute audio-visual presentation for analyzing language. In thinking about so-called big data approaches, the specific focus of this session is content analysis, which can be used for the analysis of both verbal data and visual data. Verbal data is usually written discourse, but it could also be transcribed spoken discourse. Content analysis can be more or less quantitative or qualitative in its application, ranging from much larger data sets to relatively small data sets, from using statistical tools to using fine-grained discourse analytic tools. Well, the following presentation is structured around a number of case study examples of content analytic studies. And there is also a required reading assigned to accompany the presentation, so another case study, which I'll talk about briefly at the end of the presentation. These various examples do not represent all types of content analysis, but they are quite typical of the way that content analytic principles and procedures can be used. In a nutshell, content analysis is all about finding and illuminating patterns in everyday communication. And everyday communication can indeed be surprisingly patterned. Let me offer just one fairly random example, which also leads me nicely to the first of my case studies. In particular, I'm going to start with so-called forced perspective photography, which is, of course, hugely popular. I'm almost certain that you will immediately recognize this type of photography. In this case, the photographer has located themselves and angled the camera in such a way that the person and the car in the photo are resized and positioned in order to appear that the person is handling the moon and putting it into the boot of the car. Often very creative, forced perspective photos are a well-established practice around the world, something lots and lots of people regularly like to do and to play with. In other words, it's a patterned behavior, and it has to be said, especially in tourism settings. This kind of tourist practice, posing in front of monuments and landmarks, is a quintessential, almost iconic and definitive tourist practice. It's certainly a very popular thing to do with the Jet d'eau in Geneva, but it happens quite literally all over the place. As social scientists, we're often interested in thinking about the way individuals act in quite singular, individual and idiosyncratic ways. But for the most part, we're interested in the way people are all alike, how people act as groups, collectives, or entire cultures in often very similar patterned ways. And there are any number of methods or approaches for getting at these collective patterns in people's communication, and content analysis is just one of them. I'm going to start showing you what this can look like by way of a particular forced perspective practice, which was the focus of a small content analysis my colleague and I conducted as part of a bigger project looking at the way tourists behave and interact around the Leaning Tower of Pisa in Italy, arguably one of the world's most famous tourist destinations, and also arguably one of the most famous forced perspective photographs. Our study involved us working with the photo sharing website Flickr, which is now a bit of an ancient technology. Of course, you could today use Instagram or any other kinds of social media sites for sharing photos. The key thing is that digital and social media offer wonderful insights into the way thousands of people document their attempts at doing what is often known as the Pisa push. There are hashtags devoted to the Pisa push. For researchers like us, these digital media platforms offer themselves as a perfect resource for examining what people or other people actually do and how they talk about what they or other people are doing. So initially, my colleague and I were interested to see how Pisa pushes or Pisa pushers were visually represented. But it's always interesting to see how Instagrammers and other photo sharers label and describe what's going on in the picture as well. And in this sense, therefore, we're able to do a low-level analysis of both visual content and verbal content. Let me just show you briefly what this looked like. And specifically, I want to share with you three broad patterns that we identified in our data set. A data set of a relatively large sample of Pisa push photos. And the first of these is this pattern, excusing or judging Pisa pushers. And here are three examples. This was a kind of particular stance that posters, people putting their images onto Flickr for sharing online, this is a particular stance that they took towards the Pisa pusher in question, whether it was themselves or if it was someone else. What struck us was the apologetic stance taken. And a lot of the time, posters were either excusing themselves or judging others. And in these three examples, we see the headings or captions, typical tourist, annoying leaning tower tourist, and obligatory cheesy Pisa shot. So what we notice, therefore, is an apologetic or mocking or teasing kind of stance that's taken. Underneath the final picture here, the poster appears to be a friend of the Pisa pusher. And they say, wow, here's Jane holding up the Leaning Tower of Pisa. Yep, it's cheesy, it's bad, but it's got to be done. It's got to be done, rather like the use of obligatory in the first caption, is an interesting way that tourists often behave. The fact of the matter is that it doesn't have to be done, yeah? Nor is it obligatory. And so what we have here is a classic, very patterned way in which tourists often behave. They know they're tourists doing touristy things or cheesy things, but they also want to seem like they're not just like all the rest. Well, there were all sorts of very interesting ways in which we found tourists trying to distance themselves from the touristy practice of Pisa pushing. And one of the most common patterned way that this was done was to take photographs of other tourists doing the Pisa push rather than actually doing it oneself. Yeah? And what's lovely about online resources like Flickr or Instagram is that they reveal how people trying hard to be different, to be individual, are often doing much the same thing. And in this case, we have three more examples of posters distancing themselves by laughing at others. In the first, we have someone saying, I promised myself I wouldn't do the hold the tower up photo, but I did get the next best thing. And then in the middle, there's the ironic or sarcastic tone of tourist originality. And then finally, the much more overtly judgmental mass hysteria. So once again, we witness a kind of superiority stance being taken, which positions the posters as being better than tourists. And yet, because of the data, we see the patterned way in which many of them are behaving just like other tourists. So one last pattern I want to share with you is instances where tourists try to go one step further by claiming creative superiority, a sort of variation on the theme of not doing the typical cheesy Pisa push. Again, however, when you start looking at larger amounts of evidence or data, you begin to see patterns emerging. What looks like on the surface to be rather unique or creative variations on the theme of the Pisa push become rather less creative, less individual, and more patterned. Ultimately, therefore, whether you're doing it with your foot, your finger, or your pregnant belly, you're still doing the Pisa push. And besides, there's lots of people doing precisely the same thing. So I'm sure you get the picture, but I can't help but finish with just one or two more examples of the unique creative variations on the classic Pisa push, starting with an example sent to me by a student a few years ago. The Pisa push is endlessly and quite evidently endlessly emerging in all sorts of different and not so different ways. And in addition to this one, there's also this one, which again turns out not to be quite so unique after all. Needless to say, it seems to be a boy thing. In fact, this would make for a neat content analysis research question. To what extent are creative Pisa push photos with or without penises gendered? At first sight, judging from this random sample of worldwide tourist forced perspective shots, which I showed you a moment ago, it does appear that there is a gendered patterning in these forced perspective photos, at tourist sites at least. As you will see shortly, this is precisely the kind of research question which content analysis is good at answering. But first, what I want to do is introduce you to some general information about content analysis. As I say, we're looking at content analysis as a kind of big data method for documenting patterns in discourse. That is, often in written discourse, but also in transcribed spoken discourse, and also sometimes in visual communication. And remember also that this big data idea is in scare quotes because it's always a relative thing. Big is always relative. Compared, say, to corpus linguistics, but even within content analysis, this varies tremendously. So in the way of orientation, I'm going to start with just two definitions of content analysis from some well-known scholars, and then identify a few key features. In his foundational work, Bernard Berelson described content analysis as a research technique for the objective, systematic, and quantitative description of the manifest content of communication. Well, from this early definition, I just want to call your attention to the notions of objectivity, systematicity, and quantity as key indicators. I've already suggested that quantity, bigness, is quite relative. Well, the same goes for objectivity and systematicity. I'll come to this question of manifest in just a moment. Different researchers, even those of using content analysis, can have very different views about what counts as objective as opposed to subjective, and also what systematic looks like in practice. In comparison, here's a definition offered by Klaus Krippendorf, who's one of the people most often associated with contemporary content analysis methodology. And he describes it as a research technique for making replicable and valid inferences from texts or other meaningful matter to the context of their use. At stake in this definition are the notions of replicability and validity, both of which are hallmarks of a lot of social science research. The idea that one must be systematic and transparent enough for other researchers to be able to replicate and therefore test your findings. And also that the researcher must measure or count features which actually exist and which can be clearly located in text. In other words, asking valid, answerable questions and providing valid, demonstrable answers. Well, on the basis of these two reasonable definitions as a starting point, I will offer just a few key principles about content analysis. Originally, and still quite commonly, content analysis is a method designed for the analysis of newspaper and media texts. And this is simply no longer the case, but it is a kind of still very common focus for much content analysis. As I say, for example, it can be regularly used in the analysis of transcribed talk, spoken language which has been rendered into written language. By the same token, while content analyses have predominantly been used for verbal communication studies, this is certainly no longer the case either. Many scholars use content analysis for the study of visual communication, as you'll see in just a moment. Let me just give you a brief example. These newspaper front pages are, of course, a quintessential genre of news media discourse. Printed text with lots of writing, newspapers have been the bread and butter focus of content analysis for a very long time. These particular front pages come from an online site previously called Newseum, now called Freedom Forum, which offers a daily digest of front pages from all US American newspapers. Of course, we know that this is how fewer and fewer people nowadays are sourcing their news, if at all, but the resource offers a neat insight into how big issues are regularly covered across the United States. And in this particular day, what we saw being covered was the Supreme Court ruling on marriage equality in the United States. Well, one example of the way content analysis could be used is to assess the political persuasion or the political leaning of different newspapers towards this specific issue. We could, for example, just look at the headlines. Headlines, of course, are intended as a summary of the main argument or the main point of the main story. And in this regard, we might examine different linguistic features like adjectives, nominalizations, or syntax, for example, to evaluate whether the newsmakers view the event positively or negatively. And in a moment, you're going to learn that this is what we would call valence. If you look at these headlines, for example, we start with something relatively neutral, then we move to two arguably more explicitly positive or favorable headlines, and then to two more somewhat dispassionate and possibly unfavorable headlines. In the last case, the pejorative use of gays as a noun like this is a signal. Indeed, this would make for another linguistic research question. How are LGBTQ+ people labeled in different newspapers? But it's not just the words which reveal political and cultural leanings, or biases, if you like, in newspapers. We might just as easily focus on the images carefully and deliberately selected to accompany the main story, or in the case of some front pages, none at all. In this instance, a visual content analysis, we might, for example, look at patterns in the way groups, crowds, or individuals are depicted. Or we could look at facial expressions, which is, if they're discernible, to see how people's mood is depicted, asking if this reflects the newspaper's evaluation or stance too. Well, in thinking about visual content analysis for a moment, I want to offer an example of a proper research study, and this will be the second of the 5 case studies I mentioned. I'm referring here to a 2011 study by Chelsea Hauer, Kimberly McClure, and Rebecca Poole titled Obesity Stigma in Online News, a Visual Content Analysis, and this was published in the Journal of Health Communication. As you can see from the title, Hoyer and her colleagues were interested in what they saw as the stigmatizing representation of people who are or may be obese. To start, they focused on visual representations of online news sites. Now, to give you an idea of the sort of thing that initially troubled them, I've pulled together this fairly random sample from the BBC News, the online BBC News site. Partly, I admit, I went looking for precisely the kinds of images that seemed to typify the ones that Hoyer and her colleagues found. But just take a look for a moment and see what kinds of features or aspects of these images you might consider looking at and perhaps counting to see if you can enumerate a pattern. Well, let me show you what Hoyer and her colleagues found by looking at just the abstract of their paper. An abstract, of course, being a nice, tight summary which appears at the start of all journal articles. Don't have to worry about reading all of it. I'm going to pick out something. The abstract is instructive partly because on the first hand, it shows their findings and therefore the sorts of things that content analysis can reveal. But on the second hand, it also shows how they set up their study to start with. The images in their data set were selected, first of all, from 5 major websites during a 2-week period in September of 2009, ending up with a sample of 549 newspaper stories and images. This might not seem like a lot, but the main thing is that they try to specify a defined period and select evidence from multiple sites and major news sources. And this helps to make their study feel more valid. It's also more systematic, and because they tell us what they did, it's a bit more transparent. Well, from the overall sample of 549 newspaper stories, they then examined 441 images showing people, and this is the data set that they worked with for their content analysis. And it's through their content analysis that the authors were able to document some patterns, which I've already begun to highlight here. For example, they found that 65% or 2/3 of the images showed actual overweight people and obese people, but 27% showed people who are not actually overweight. Beyond this, the images were more likely to show people's heads, faces, or whatever cut out of the photo so that it was only their abdomens or their lower bodies which were shown. And people were also more likely to be shown eating and drinking. Yeah? Meanwhile, and finally, people were less likely to be shown fully clothed and less likely to be shown wearing professional clothing. Now, you would have to read the paper to find out how Hoyer and her colleagues interpret these findings and then connect them to wider issues about health communication. All I need you to see for now is that patterns were identified by counting specific features in the data set, all of which points to the possibility of medical inaccuracies, unfairness, or bias in the representation of obesity. So thinking about this second case study, I want to return to the key features of content analysis. So just to recap, content analysis uses relatively large samples of data, such as news articles, commercials, movies, or texts, and it then specifies certain relevant features in these texts for the sake of identifying patterns across multiple instances of the text. Usually, but not always necessarily, content analysis entails the enumeration of these recurrent features. Sometimes detailed counts are offered, sometimes these are evaluated by means of statistical testing. At other times, the enumeration is much looser and more impressionistic. Unless some kind of basic quantification is offered, at least a percentage or ratio, there's not really much point doing content analysis. So that's the enumeration of these features. And then the key from the definitions earlier, a good content analysis should always be replicable, and therefore it needs to be systematic, well organized, and transparent. People need to know exactly what you did. And finally, to return to Berelson's slightly outdated definition, I want to comment on the idea of manifest content. In other words, things that are clear or obvious in the text. In fact, content analysis can consider both manifest and latent content, content which is by implication not included or less included or more hidden and obscure. So in thinking about the Hoyer et al. Study, for example, they were certainly looking at manifest details, like pictures of people eating and drinking or not wearing much clothing. But what their study also exposed was the latent details, like people not shown doing exercise, people not wearing professional clothing. So ultimately, by documenting what's shown but also what's not shown, content analysis provides evidence of what we call dominant representations. In other words, the most common, repeated way that issues, people, and events are depicted. Let me give you another nice example. In this large-scale, multi-year project directed by Stacy Smith and run from the Annenberg School for Communication and Journalism at the University of Southern California in the USA, a hugely influential center of excellence in mass communication and media studies, by the way. Well, every year, Stacy Smith and her colleagues, since 2007, as part of their inclusion initiative, they have been conducting content and analytic studies of mainstream Hollywood movies. The goal has been a fairly simple one, to enumerate, to document by enumerating the presence in these movies of roles played by women, people of color, LGBTQ plus people, and disabled people. And of course, for the last 100 years, the dominant representation in Hollywood-produced cinema has been mostly about white, straight, non-disabled men. So Stacy and her colleagues ask, to what extent has this dominant representation been becoming more diverse, more inclusive, or more representative of the society at large? In their most recent report, titled Inequality in 1,600 Popular Films, Smith and her colleagues looked back to see how the representations had been changing over time and up until 2022. And here's just a schematic representation of their main findings. If you like, you can pause to take a slightly closer look at this. All I want to point you to are the kind of main patterns that they found in their data. With reference only, for example, in this case to gender representations, the authors looked at a total of 4,218 characters across the 100 top films of 2022. And what they found was that only 34.6% of characters were female identified. So as such, the ratio of speaking characters was 1.89 males to every one female, almost double. And the percentage of girls and women on screen, they found, has actually not changed since 2008. Meanwhile, 38% of all speaking characters were from underrepresented racial or ethnic groups, which is just a little lower than their presence in the US population generally. So arguably not too unfair or biased. However, just 2%, that's 87 instances, in just 2% of speaking or named characters were openly LGBTQ+. And also 41% of the LGBTQ characters appeared in speaking roles that were inconsequential to the story. Finally, less than 2% of all speaking characters were shown with a disability. And in fact, what they found is there's been no meaningful difference in the percentage of speaking characters with a disability across an 8-year time span. Make of this what you will. The point is that in such a high-profile, influential setting like Hollywood movies, the representation of people really does make a difference. These movies are watched by billions of people around the world, and it does matter what we see in films, who's represented, who's not represented. And so what Stacy Smith and her colleagues at the USC, the University of Southern California, what they've been able to do with content analysis is prove that it's not an even or fair playing field. So with reference to the USC's case study and to the Hoyer et al. Study, I want to just highlight some of the core practices and procedures of content analysis, what it actually sort of needs to look like a little bit on the ground and in practice. I'm going to be turning to coding and reliability testing in just a moment, but first I want to look at research questions and units of analysis, two of the key steps, if you like, in doing a content analysis. Regarding the key steps shown here on the left, you've already started to see from the case studies how researchers go about selecting and sampling text to build a data set in ways which are valid. By looking more closely at the case studies, and especially the required reading assignment for this presentation, you'll also get a feel for the way analysis itself is actually done. In other words, the way data is generated and then interpreted or analyzed. So for now, I just want to start by saying something about the typical research questions that content analysis is usually or often used to answer. Most often, content analyses are used to identify the priority given to certain issues. In other words, how visible or salient certain kinds of images, stories, or events are. And you've seen this already with the University of Southern California study, which examined how much visibility or salience is given to socially minoritized people. And this kind of research question can help researchers determine what stories, which people's lives, and what sort of issues get repeated over and over, and which are given less coverage. Well, along similar lines, content analysis is often concerned with demonstrating or sort of pinpointing and demonstrating and proving, if you like, bias in a more quantitative way. And in this regard, the Hoyer et al. Study really helped to show the kind of biased and unfair way the public health issue of obesity was being represented in the news media. And by looking at how obese people were being represented over and over again. And so research questions about bias can help draw attention to the very particular and often skewed or unfair way certain issues or certain people are represented. And finally, as you've also seen in the University of Southern California study by Stacy Smith and her colleagues, long-term research projects, and over the long term, research projects using content analysis can ask historical questions to sort of document again and to demonstrate how the coverage of issues, topics, or people has been changing over time or not. So as I say, for now I'm going to skip over the next step, sampling, and move straight to units of analysis. And if you've successfully completed the homework assignment related to this session, you should already have started figuring out what we mean by units of analysis. But let me quickly just summarize. This is one of the most central steps, a kind of, if you like, the cornerstone of content analysis, and that's the identification of these two different units of analysis, variables and values. A variable, just to recap, is the specific feature the researcher wants to enumerate or count. And this could be, for example, something like headline length or image location or group labels or positive and negative adjectives. And in the Hoyer et al. Study, for example, they looked at whether people were clothed or unclothed, how much body was shown or not shown, and so on. For the University of Southern California study, the main variables were presence and absence of women, disabled people, queer people, or people of color, and whether or not they were in a speaking role or not, whether they were the main character or not. Each variable then, of course, must be assigned a fixed set of values. These are the main options available for each variable. For example, news reports about demonstrations might use different group labels, which could include values like protesters, crowd, mob, or other. For the Hoyer et al. Study, the variable clothing might have included fully clothed, partially clothed, unclear. Meanwhile, for the University of Southern California study, the variable of speaking role might have included something as simple as a value yes major or yes minor or none. With these core practices and procedures established, I want to start turning to an in-class assignment and some more practice with content analysis. Before I do that, in order to set up the assignment, I need to offer you a fourth case study. And again, this is another example from my own work, which highlights some of the key steps and core practices of content analysis. I used content analysis as my main method for a 2006 study published in the Journal of Computer-Mediated Communication. The paper was titled "The Meta-Discursive Construction and Popular Exaggeration of New Media Language in the Print Media." Let me just show you what prompted this study by way of two newspaper extracts. These extracts come from real online or offline newspaper stories about so-called web speak or textees, basically young people's language practices when using digital media for communicating. And in those days, this was mostly related to instant messaging, but especially text messaging or SMS. It wasn't until, of course, the 2010s with the rise of smartphones that we saw things like WhatsApp emerging, and therefore, along with that, things like emojis. Let's just have a look at these two. Online language has developed into a shorthand that all but obliterates the Queen's English. Our kids log on and catch the web-speak virus. This new communicable disease spreads like jam on toast, and presto, Speldrek, the next generation. And then the second one. As a dialect, text or textese is thin and unimaginative. It is bleak, bald, sad shorthand, drab shrink talk. The dialect has a few hieroglyphs, codes comprehensible only to initiates, and a range of face symbols. Linguistically, it's all pig's ear. Texting is penmanship for illiterates. What struck me, and what I want you to notice, is just how negative these comments were, full of judgment and full of pessimism about the impact of young people's language practices on standard language, and especially on things like good grammar and the Queen's English. Well, needless to say, then and still today, this material is written almost exclusively by adult journalists, as if none of them were texting at all. Well, it was for this reason that I decided to look into the matter more closely to determine A, how common and widespread this biased perspective was, and B, how these types of reports were thematically organized. In other words, what I wanted to do was to establish the dominant ways of representing this particular issue. So my research questions were therefore about priority and salience, but also about bias. Now look, I'm not going to go into detail, but here is what the section about the data generation looks like in the actual paper from 2006. I'm going to reproduce this here just to show you how I went about sampling and building a data set for my content analysis. So to begin with, I used these massive online news sort of databases, particularly ProQuest and LexisNexis, to search for any reports which were directly and specifically focused on language, young people, and technology over a fixed period between 2001 and 2005. So I've defined my period, and I've explained how I went to what my search terms were, if you like. And then it was in this way that I was able to generate a sample of 156 articles, which I then edited down for various reasons to build a data set of 101 articles. Now, that's not a huge data set for sure, but it was sufficient for documenting and proving some of the patterned ways in which the issue was being reported at the time. And as I say, this content analysis was more of a thematic analysis, identifying recurrent themes across the data set rather than counting the occurrence or the occurrence of specific verbal and linguistic features. Well, in this regard, for the in-class assignment, I want to share with you some of my original data from this earlier study and have you do a kind of mini content analysis. Okay, so setting up the in-class assignment, the full title of my 2006 paper included the thesis title From Statistical Panic to Moral Panic. And this refers to a major theme or variable I identified in my data set, something I called statistical panic. And I used the label statistical panic to describe exaggerated or superlative claims about texting. Usually these were based on reported figures or numbers. And my argument was that these wild claims feed popular anxieties or fears about the impact of digital media or digital media language, hence panic. Just take another look at one other extract which demonstrates this nicely. More than 16 million text messages are sent every day between Britain's 40 million mobile users. That's 10 times as many as last year, and experts say the total sent in 2000 could top an amazing 7 billion. Well, in this extract, 16 million every day and 7 billion in capital letters are verbal tactics for communicating extreme quantity. Meanwhile, the 10 times as many as last year helps to communicate the rapid growth or dramatic spread of text messaging. You might also just note the reference to experts here, which is an oddly non-specific, unspecified kind of expert. And this would make another nice content analytic variable. We could call that information source, and we could have values like named or unnamed, or scientific or popular. But let me get back to the analysis I did for this statistical panic variable, because this is what I would like you to work with too. In the example extract above, what I've already pointed you to are two values that I called quantity and growth or spread. These were in fact two of the four values I looked at. They were also monetary value and usage or demographics. And it's at this point that you should pause the video, turn to the worksheet, and complete the in-class assignment. We can now return to practices and procedures, and this time looking a little bit more closely at coding. This is also a chance for me to say something about reliability testing. Once the researcher has identified their units of analysis, the variables and the values, they need to return to the data in order to code the entire data set. This can be very time-consuming work. And in fact, as you may even have begun to feel from doing the in-class assignment, it's kind of slow, step by step, in order to code each of the extracts or units, even if it's just a few like the ones you've done. What's essential is that this coding process be as consistent and objective as possible. And this is all about reliability. And there are two types of reliability in content analysis. First, there's intra-coder reliability, which means that if there is only one person doing the coding, as in the case of your in-class assignment, they are consistent across the whole data set and over time. Sometimes, especially for very large projects and data sets, however, there's more than one person doing the coding, in which case we have to be concerned about inter-coder reliability. In other words, that all the coders must be doing exactly the same thing, coding consistently, the same way as the other coders, and also over time. Take the example of the University of Southern California study and also the Hoyer et al. Studies. Everyone doing the coding would need to agree what counts as a major speaking role or a minor speaking role, or what counts as fully clothed or partially clothed. Almost always, and again, especially with larger studies and with larger data sets, the researchers need to test and report inter-coder reliability. And often this is done by using a low-level statistical method. Now, there's no need to go into more detail at this time, but I just want to show you two more case study examples of much larger content analyses, and one of which is the one that was conducted for in the required reading that you've been asked to complete. But before I get to that, still thinking about core practices and procedures in content analysis, I'm going to offer this fifth case study from another project that I conducted with a number of graduate students while I was at the University of Washington in Seattle in the United States. I myself never got around to publishing anything from this project, but some of the PhD students did, as with this journal article from 2011. In many ways, this study is a classic example of classic content analysis involving the investigation of news media language and specifically news media language from newspapers. If you recall those examples I gave you from the marriage equality decision and those kind of front pages. And so in this instance, the research team was interested in how newspapers around the United States reported the Day Without Immigrants demonstrations, which took place for the first time in 2006. So here are some examples of newspaper front pages taken from the same museum resource that I mentioned earlier. Often often taking the day off work, demonstrators or protesters, and the choice of label between are you a demonstrator or a protester or something else, these matter, these labels. What people were doing on this day around the country was marching through the high streets of many towns and cities to make a statement about how important immigration and immigrants are to the United States' economic life. In a show of solidarity, you can also know that many shops, restaurants, and other businesses closed that day as well. Well, what interested us was how this national grassroots political event was reported around the country, and particularly we were interested to see whether it was reported positively or negatively. And for this, our data set comprised 297 newspaper front pages from the day after the event. And we looked mostly at the linguistic or verbal content from these front pages, even though the images were revealing, most of it focused on the linguistic content. Take, for example, the words used in the headlines here, which are, of course, a key summary, again, of the main news story and a major way that the newsmakers reveal their stance toward the issues being reported, what their kind of a political opinion or persuasion is. In the headlines in these three cases, you can see, like we did, you sense a sort of more favorable opinion about the demonstrations. You have a day without immigrants, marching for rights, and then this sort of quote or quasi-quote, "We are America." Well, needless to say, the pattern here, the positive pattern, was matched also with something somewhat different. Here, the tone shifts dramatically from the pointedly bland making a point through to 1.1 million Hispanics hit streets, skip work, through to immigrant uprising. Well, it's quite striking how the choice of words in these headlines makes such a difference in terms of the cultural politics at work, the extent to which the newsmakers were supportive of the demonstrations or sympathetic towards the immigrants or not. And in these three instances, making a point feels somewhat disrespectful as an underestimation of the demonstrators' feelings, right? Then the label Hispanics is often one not preferred by Latino Americans, and it can feel almost offensive sometimes. And then the implication that demonstrators were simply skipping work suggests that they were somehow being lazy or motivated by simply missing a day of work. And then, of course, uprising has a heavily loaded set of connotations around things like revolution and social unrest. So again, the analysis itself is not why I'm showing you this material. I really just wanted to reveal some of the behind-the-scenes content analytic procedures that we engaged in. So as you proceed to do the in-class exercise, what I also want you to do is to think about these kinds of things as well, if you haven't done it already. In this regard, I want to show you what our coding sheet looked like, which was really quite extensive and elaborate. These are just 2 of the 6 pages from our original coding sheet. And what you can see here are some of the linguistic variables we decided to look at and to count. And for each one, you can see the different values assigned to each variable. You can be sure that it took a lot of hours of work to code nearly 300 front pages and looking for nearly 100 variables. There were, of course, 5 coders, and each person coded a sample from the main data set, something like 60 pages, front pages each. Nonetheless, you can also imagine then that intercoder reliability was terribly important. Let me just give you a feel for the top of this page here, where we see that each coder had to start by indicating a unit number, in other words, which front page was being coded from the overall data set. They had to obviously give their name so we could keep an eye on the different coders, and then they just listed the paper itself. And I'll just give you one example of variable 46A, which relates specifically to the linguistic content of the headlines and the valence, this issue of valence, which is about the positivity or the negativity of the position taken. And as you can see here, we chose 4 values: positive, neutral, negative, or mixed. And again, the point is not to look at any detail, but just to show what a large-scale content analysis can look like from the inside, and specifically in this case, the coding sheet. And there's an awful lot of work that goes into developing a coding sheet like this, and then the coding itself can be incredibly tedious and time-consuming. But once this work is done, results can be generated very quickly. And this is when the enumeration happens and when the patterns start to emerge. Speaking of which, let me just end with the required reading as yet another example of a larger scale content analysis. The reading that you've been assigned is a co-authored journal article published in New Media and Society in 2020. This paper reports an investigation into the way that young people, teens, if you like, and their technology uses are commonly represented in commercial stock photography. This particular study also combined content analysis with social semiotics, but it's the content analysis that interests me here. Initially, my colleagues and the student collaborators that we worked with were quite concerned with the way young people's technology practices were being talked about in the news media. And in this instance, however, our focus was on the visual representation of this issue and the kinds of images that often accompany news media stories when they're reporting on these. And it's very similar. This work grows out very much from the work around text messaging language from 2006. Well, nowadays, like so many media companies, newspapers, whether they're online or offline, use stock photos. They buy photos rather than make their own photos, and they buy them from global image banks. So in order to make sense of the news media imagery, we decided to look specifically at stock photography, such as the selection shown here. While still thinking about the core practices and procedures, I'd like to just call your attention to the research questions which formed the basis of our study. And here's a relevant extract where we list our research questions. And even though the wording is a little bit technical, research questions 1 and 2 are so typical of the kinds of questions we ask in a content analysis. Yeah? The first question refers to dominant conventions, which is another way of saying major patterns. In other words, what were the typical ways stock photos represented young people and their digital media practices? This is a mostly descriptive question that's just about identifying and counting certain features in the images. Then in question 2, we set out to answer a more interpretive question about the ways that these common patterns, what we called meta-discursive visualizations, reveal certain biases, i.e. ideological lines. And we do this by way of some technical analytical features, iconization, erasure, and recursivity. But the point is to see what information is repeatedly made visible or salient and what is not. And in this regard, our study was really very similar to the Hoyer et al. Study about asking, are the representations fair or unfair? Then on pages 532 and 533, you can also read about our sampling procedure. In a nutshell, we made a data set by sampling 600 stock photos, top sliced, from the world's 3 largest image banks, Getty, Shutterstock, and Alamy. So that's 200 from each image bank. And as you can see from the second excerpt here, we deliberately took the photos identified by the image bank itself and from our search as the photos that are considered most popular or most relevant. And this also helped to give our data set validity. We were only looking at major global image banks, the first most popular or relevant images, the ones that often are bought. Well, much like the case study for the Day Without Immigrants project, our stock photography content analysis hinged on the development of a fairly extensive coding sheet, and there are just 2 pages from the coding sheet. On the left-hand side, we had some quite obvious variables, number of people, gender, age, ethnicity, etc. And at the bottom, you can also see we wanted to know if people's faces were shown. If so, what sort of expression? Were they happy, sad, and so on? Positive, negative, neutral, and so on. Again, a valence question. And then on the right-hand side, at the top, we had a variable to track if young people were seen looking at the camera, at other people, or at their phones. And then again, at the bottom of the page here, we wanted to document where the technology appeared in the photo. For example, was it in the center or not? Finally, as just one last thing to highlight before finishing the presentation, one last thing to highlight from the reading also is that the issue of reliability and reliability testing had to be taken quite seriously. The journal that this paper was published in is a fairly high-profile journal, and we also had 5 different coders. So we were obliged to demonstrate intercoder reliability by way of some low-level statistical testing. You can see here, before the proceeding with our final coding, a Krippendorff alpha test was run on a subsample of just the Getty images. Yeah, so we didn't do everything, we did some of it. We took a random sample, as it were, to check that everyone was coding consistently across all of the different variables. Yeah? And if the intercoder reliability is statistically weak, then it's important to recalibrate the coding system, train everybody again to make sure they're doing the same thing. And it's only this way that you can make sure that the results and the patterns which emerge and are counted are reliable. Well, as you've seen through the course of this presentation, content analysis can vary greatly in terms of its scale, how big and small the data sets are, but also relatedly about whether the approach taken is a more quantitative one or a more qualitative one. And in this presentation, you've seen examples of both large scale and analyses depending on some very detailed and sometimes statistically verified counting procedures, and also some small-scale analyses relying on looser enumeration and the identification of dominant themes. It might be tempting to characterize these as being more objective and descriptive approaches and more subjective and interpretive approaches. But all content analyses depend on their being systematic in terms of sampling and coding. They must also be transparent, enabling readers to know how the analysis was organized and conducted. And of course, they must always start out with valid, socially and scientifically relevant research questions. As is often noted, the quality of the answers one gets is only as good as the quality of the questions one's asked.